God could never use someone like me. What I did was too bad, too destructive, too shameful. If you've ever felt this way before, today's video is for you. Maybe it's your past, maybe it's a sin you're still struggling with, maybe it's a mistake you keep replaying over and over and over again, or a label you just can't seem to shake. Whatever it is that's got you swallowed up in guilt and shame, feeling like God could never use you or feeling like you're too far gone, I want to remind you that God can use this too, and that your past doesn't cancel your calling. The Bible story we're going to be looking at today is so powerful, and it shows us that we are never too far gone for God to use. He can use even the most painful or shameful parts of our past. Shame doesn't have to get the final word because God's redemption is plentiful. But if we don't want shame to get the final word, something crucial needs to take place. We're going to unpack what that is by looking at two different stories in the Bible of sin and shame with two very different outcomes. Before we get into it, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel. I make Christian faith and lifestyle content aimed at encouraging you to know God more through His Word and to grow in His likeness, and I would love to have you here. And then give this video a thumbs up if you find it helpful or encouraging. So the first story we're going to look at is when Saul, the first king of Israel, is rejected by God as king over Israel because he was disobedient to God. I have a whole video unpacking this story in great detail if you want to check it out, but essentially God gives Saul a very specific command to completely destroy the Amalekites, Israel's enemy, and he wasn't to spare anyone or anything. But instead of obeying, Saul partially obeys. He destroys the Amalekites, but he takes their king alive, and he also spares the best of their sheep and oxen and fattened calves. And God's response to Saul's partial obedience is this: because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. This story shows us the sobering truth that partial obedience is complete disobedience. In it, we see that Saul thought he could mostly obey while still holding partially to his own way, but his partial obedience literally cost him the kingship. It's a powerful story about the importance of complete obedience, but I feel like it could also provoke a question in us. If I disobey God or sin in some way, does that mean my calling will be canceled too, like Saul's was? Does a past mistake disqualify me? Will my own sin stop me from being used by God? And here's the honest biblical answer: it can, but it doesn't have to. To understand what I mean, we need to look at the second story, and that's the story of David and Bathsheba. If you're not familiar with this story, it's found in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, but cliff notes basically, one day David was walking on the rooftop of the king's house and saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. The only problem was this woman wasn't David's wife. In fact, she was someone else's wife, Uriah, who was out battling on behalf of Israel. So David sees this woman bathing and he lusts after her, and then he sends his servants to go get her, and then he sleeps with her and impregnates her. And once David found this out, he tried to cover his tracks by bringing her husband home from the war to spend a night with her, thinking that he could pass the baby off as Uriah's. Well, Uriah wouldn't comply. He refused to enjoy a comfortable night with his wife while his men were still on the battlefield, so he slept outside on the doorsteps of the king's house instead. David's plan A to cover up his sin of adultery didn't work, so he came up with a plan B. He sent Uriah to the front lines of the battle to be killed. Once Uriah was dead, David took Bathsheba to be his wife, and she bore him a son, the son born of their sinful union. I shared that I've been going through the free David Story course by Hillsdale College, and one of the reasons I love their courses so much is because I can think that I'm so familiar with the Bible story already, and no matter what, when I take their classes, I always learn something new and I'm always left in awe. The David Story course actually has full lessons on both the first story we touched on this video, where Saul was rejected as king, and also on this story of David and Bathsheba, and I highly encourage you to watch it because there are so many little insights that Professor Justin Jackson unpacks that I had never caught before. But one that stood out to me when I was watching it the other day is how after David has Uriah killed, he sends this message to the commander of his army via a messenger. Thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against against the city and overthrow it and encourage him. David is basically trying to play it off here by saying, who dies in the war is random. Some make it out, some don't, but don't let this matter displease you. And what Professor Justin Jackson pointed out is that David's statement here stands in stark contrast and opposition to how we're told God feels about this situation in verse 27. Here's what 2 Samuel 11 verse 27 says, "But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord." In other words, this was a big deal. I think human nature is very much what David tried to do. We try to minimize and downplay our sin, but God says that any sin is displeasing to him. It goes against his perfect standard, and as Romans tells us, the wages of sin is death. Before we finish unpacking this story, I just want to say that if you haven't already, you have to enroll in this David story course by Hillsdale College. Again, it's completely free. It is so good, and it's been such a powerful and insightful resource to me as I've been reading through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's literally like free Bible college, but better because you can go through the courses at your own pace as you have little pockets of time. My husband and I are both obsessed with their courses, and I just love getting to tell you about them because I know they will be a huge blessing to your life spiritually, like they have been for me. And if you haven't heard me talk about Hillsdale College before, they have over 40 free online courses on a variety of different topics, so definitely check them out and take advantage. I cannot recommend them enough. If you want to join me in taking the free David Story course or any of the other Hillsdale College classes, you can go right now to hillsdale.edu/Kaci to enroll. Again, that's hillsdale.edu/Kaci. I'm going to have that link down in the description as well. And a huge thank you to Hillsdale for working with me on today's video. Now back to our stories. So both Saul and David sinned, and arguably David's sin was even quote unquote bigger in human eyes, though we know that in God's eyes, sin is sin. But Saul's sin is that he didn't fully obey, whereas David committed adultery, then straight up murdered the husband of the woman he committed adultery with. Yet Saul's sin cost him the kingship. It cost him his calling, and David's sin did not. What was the difference? Well, I think one of the big differences we see in these two stories was the heart posture of these two men toward their sin. In 1 Samuel 15, when the prophet Samuel confronts Saul over his sin, he blamed other people. He said, "The people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God." He blamed other people and then took ownership over the good part. He said, "We destroyed the Amalekites and we devoted the rest to the destruction, but those people saved some. They saved the good sheep and oxen and fattened calves." So Saul blamed other people, then he tried to defend himself by essentially saying, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, all the rest I devoted to destruction like God told me to do." And then even when he finally acknowledges his sin in verse 24, Saul's biggest concern seems to be having the consequences of his sin removed. He pleads with Samuel to honor him and grasps after Samuel's cloak. David, on the other hand, had a very different response. When God sends the prophet Nathan to rebuke David and expose the sin he had committed of committing adultery with Bathsheba, then killing her husband, here's what David says. 2 Samuel 12:13, "I have sinned against the Lord." David didn't try to blame someone else for his sin. He didn't say, "Well, Bathsheba was bathing naked on the rooftop. What was I supposed to do?" He didn't try to minimize his sin anymore like he initially did. He didn't say, "Well, I wasn't the one who actually technically killed Uriah. It just happened in battle." David didn't try to defend himself. He didn't say, "I'm not that bad, okay? I made one mistake one time." He simply took full ownership of his sin before the Lord with a humble, broken, and contrite heart. Scripture commends a broken and contrite heart over one's sin in Psalm 51, verse 17. "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." This psalm was actually written by David after Nathan confronted him about his sin with Bathsheba, and I have a whole video walking line by line through this psalm that I encourage you to watch if you are feeling guilty about your sin or just consumed by shame. I also want to point out that David, while he did plead to God for mercy regarding the consequences of his sin, which was that the child born out of infidelity would die, he also humbly accepted this consequence when God's answer to his pleading was no. And I think that's a key thing for us to recognize, is that our sin will hold consequences. Sometimes those are natural consequences because God has designed us and this world that we live in a certain way, and when we don't follow that way, it leads to consequences, like when you don't follow the law of gravity, for example, and you drop a glass on the ground, the glass is going to break. But sometimes God also disciplines us by giving us consequences, such as with Saul losing the kingship, or with David's consequence of losing his son. David had other consequences as a result of this sin as well, like the violence and division within his own household that the prophet Nathan foretold. So it's not to say that if we're repentant, we'll always escape the consequences of our sin. Sometimes God graciously allows us to, but not always. But what we do see in the story of David is that his sin did not cancel his calling. He still remained the king of Israel, and his second son with Bathsheba, Solomon, became king after him and even became a part of the lineage of Christ. Not only that, David was called a man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect, but because he was humble and repentant. He was soft and pliable in the hands of God rather than resolved to cling to his own way and refusing to take ownership of his sin. David's story shows us that God can use anything, literally anything from our past, anything that we've done, any sin we've struggled with or are struggling with currently, when we humbly give it to him, when we ask for forgiveness, when we turn from our sin and allow his glory to shine through our weaknesses and in redeeming our broken pieces. I pray that this story encouraged you like it did for me and just pointed you to the glory and goodness of our God. I would love to hear from you down in the comments. Is your heart softened or hardened to God in your sin or areas of shame? I would love to hear any thoughts that stood out to you from this video down in the comments. And as a reminder, if you want to join me in taking the David Story course for free, you can head to hillsdale.edu/Kaci to enroll. Again, that's going to be down in the description. Thank you so much for being here with me in this video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.